Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming here today. And this is sort of a supplement to yesterday. Yesterday was a little disheartening, to be candid with you. I thought we, Representative Claris and I, on behalf of our respective caucuses, put forth plans and ideas as we understood a room that had a understanding that what was presented in that room and what was talked about in that room would remain in that room. And apparently, the sanctity for which we believed we were negotiating turned out to be not true. That gives us great pause of ideas that we can share in a room where people may believe political advantages are sought by leaking information. It clearly did not come from the Republican side. Candidly, I honestly believe it did not come from the governor's office. And it gives me great concern to stand here and say that when information is given out, by the way, the information that was given out was not 100% accurate because it wasn't the freshest information, because it was given out before we even finished our presentation. And it gives me great concern that that's being done in a room where what we did was try to give out information the night before so that people could ask questions about our proposal and about our ideas. That being said, if it is going to be leaked, Representative Claris and I believe that, therefore, it's up to us now to put forth our plan in our words, with our context, our meaning, our philosophy, and our rationale, as opposed to people who leak the information, perhaps spinning it to their political advantage. So that's what we're going to be doing here today. And with enough said on that issue, I will turn over to Representative Claris.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for joining us today. What we have on our PowerPoint is our deficit mitigation proposals that we proposed yesterday, if we can start with that. We all know how we got here. We got here based on bad fiscal decisions, bad information. We base those fiscal decisions on. But we are at a crossroads now. We have come out of last budget with a $113 million deficit. We went into this budget with significant holes from the start, and the upcoming biennium is already in deficit by close to $3 billion. Over the past 4 years, we've gone from with $1.6 billion of what was once operating expenses to bonding. And the reason for that is to circumvent the system and to make people think that we are spending less money than we are. And all of this is on the heels of the 2 largest tax increases in the state's history. As a result of that, small businesses and large businesses alike, so whether it's the GEs of the world or Joe's Coffee Shop down the street, are all suffering and trying to get out of Connecticut. Although they love it here, they cannot afford to be here any longer. We're not growing the high-paying jobs we were before and that we need to do for people to be able to sustain a life here. And people are leaving Connecticut for those reasons. Okay, you guys are blocking my PowerPoint. I can't even see it. So that's why I'm going like this. But what we have to do today, you have heard a lot of Republican proposals throughout time. You've heard Democrat proposals throughout time. You've heard governor's proposals throughout time. But what we need to do is plan for the future of Connecticut in a way that we can come to consensus. And the way we do that is twofold. We not only fix the problem we're in now, because that's our statutory obligation, but we make structural changes so this state can sustain itself not for the next month, not for the next 6 months, but for generations to come. A lot of you hear what we're going to do, but what we want to tell you today is what we're not going to do in this budget. And what we are not doing, and if we go back a month or so and we talk about hospital cuts and Medicaid cuts, we are not cutting hospitals in any way, shape, or form, or Medicaid. We felt strongly about it a month or 2 ago, and we stood up here and we told you that that is not the way to go. That is not the way to run a budget, by taking away from the people that need it the most. We do not cut from services for the intellectually disabled. We do not cut from people who need it the most. We do not hurt the poor and the disabled. This is something we've talked about and we feel strongly about, and we have continued this in this budget proposal.
So now what we're going to talk about is the short-term initiatives, the shortcuts that we're going to do to fill the gap. As you all know, we're trying to close the gap between $350 and $370 million in fiscal year 2016 and $400 million at least for 2017. I will also note we found out about that $400 million just a few hours before we did the presentation, so our proposal doesn't specifically address that. And you'll notice that because our proposal is $372.8 million for fiscal year 16 and $166.8 million for 17 because we're working on numbers that were then known. One of the things we want to talk about is put back on the table is our Republican prioritized progress, which is our transportation, to get $67 billion in 30 years. No taxes, no tolls, making, you guys were here when we did our presentation on that a while ago, making tough decisions on what we're going to fund through our general obligation accounts. But however, if we use the money, which is roughly $158 million that was in the Democrats' budget that they approved for transportation. If you remember, there was a portion of the sales tax that went to transportation. That enhances our Republican idea for transportation. So I think there could be some common ground there. Once again, Representative Claris and I were trying to put together a budget that kept intact a lot of the philosophies that the majority party and the governor put forward in an effort to try to reach common ground. So when we're putting this budget together, we tried the best we could to dovetail. This is an example of that dovetail. Next slide, please. So one of the things the governor's proposed is that he can cut $93 million from bottom line savings. This is not going to happen by virtue of lapses that normally would be found. We're going to have to identify the lapses. So we believe the governor's asked for, and we concur, that he would be allowed to identify these lapses if simply under other expenses he cut 10% from every line item under other expenses. That is not specific line items, just a general miscellaneous and all the cuts. That's $50 million right there of the 93. And we think if the caucuses got together, we could find the other 43 so we can ensure services aren't cut. We can ensure that the people of Connecticut get everything they're entitled to. We also look to eliminate 39 of the new jobs, saving the money that's on your sheets that we've handed out, 4.3 in 16 and 4.5 in 17. Turn the page. There's $13 million given to nursing homes. We're not touching that, but what wasn't talked about and was not part of the budget is a $4.8 million that was unilaterally transferred to union nursing homes. That was nothing the legislature approved. It was just in a memo that we saw. We're saying, listen, let's put that back in. You've seen juvenile justice functions currently under DCF to the judicial court support services. You've seen that in our budget. You've seen that in the Democrat budget. We've brought it. It was dropped before this budget was approved, so we're bringing that back. That is a savings. We want to eliminate the legislative commissioners, the commissions, I should say. Those are the African American, Latino, the women. If you notice, the governor in his cuts that were also leaked apparently had the same. So there's commonality there. And then we want to eliminate various, and there's a list of 4% cuts that we're doing in some areas, some single-payer specific exemptions, for instance, Excel, Webster, Bank Stadium over in Bridgeport, where the sales tax was exempted. We're saying let's put that back next. We also are going to reduce the franking privileges for legislators, which are $1 million, create an overtime accountability. Overtime was $220 million last year. The governor made a cut of $20 million, $10 million in each year. We're saying we could do better. If we put an Office of Accountability in there who are reviewing these things, when someone's looking over your shoulder, I would suggest there's an automatic savings there. And if you put some procedures in which people get overtime as opposed to unilaterally determining on their own, I would suggest we can pick up some savings there. We agreed with the governor's $5.9 million in delaying the manager's salary, and we think that there are efficiencies that we had in our last budget of the Southbury Training School. Turn the page. We're looking at cutting the election grant by for Citizen Election Fund by 20%. We accept the governor's rescissions that he did before, with the exception of the hospital, the mental health, and the DDS. We don't accept those. There's some other small rescissions he made. We're fine with that. We're eliminating the Energy Star sales tax exemption. For those of you who were around when that was put in, people were trying to incent people to buy Energy Star appliances. I defy you to find a non-Energy Star appliance that's out there. So mission accomplished, so we don't really need that anymore. We're going to do a retirement incentive program. Inadvertently, when we talked about it with the group yesterday, we called it an early retirement incentive program. It is not an early retirement incentive program. That was wrongfully labeled by us. It should have said a retirement incentive program. That is, people who are already eligible to retire would get, we're thinking, 3 years added on. If they're not eligible, the 3 years would not make them eligible. Next page. Some of the business changes we were going to make, we'll go through this really fast. Eliminate the unitary combined reporting. That's the subsidiary stuff. We agree with the governor to restore the 70% cap. Once again, commonality. 50, 60, 70, I believe, is what the governor laid out. We agree with. We also talk about the single payer system for all, single factor system, I should say, for all C corporations. Where we disagree with the governor, we think we need to change the unitary definition, which is the first bullet point. We get rid of that. I think we're in compliance with the governor's request. The next two, the 15-day not reporting that income, the governor has put that out there. We agree. Modify the implementer for the $6 billion, which arguably was a GE issue. We agree. The other thing we would like to put in, which all of our caucuses have received a gazillion phone calls, is this gross receipt tax on propane for folks who use it for energy. It's $50,000. It's, the amount of phone calls we were saying, we might as well try to raise the money to get rid of it because we got so many phone calls. Next slide. That's just the whole summary of all those things put together, and that we just went quickly through. That's all of them put in one sheet for your review.
In case anybody's curious, a gazillion is more than a bazillion, so that's a lot of phone calls. We're going to continue on the long-term initiatives that we've proposed. First is the transportation lockbox language, as the governor has talked about and we have talked about several times, as far as adding to predictability for the money that we have put in certain areas. Spending, enacting a constitutional spending cap, and I know you might say, well, we already have that, but interestingly enough, in 1992, when the voters voted overwhelmingly for a constitutional spending cap, part of that language was that the legislature would follow up and put specific language as to defining it, and I know this might be shocking to everybody, but the legislature never did that. So that's why we have been kind of winging it since then and moving money left and right into different accounts. We moved $1.8 billion of pension liability from under the cap, which by definition makes people think we're spending less money than we actually are. And to that end, we also would recommend capping the amount of money we bond to $1.8 billion. Competitively bid the correctional managed health care contract, which once again, oddly enough, has never been competitively bid. We spend millions of dollars on that health care plan, and we have never gone out to see how we can make it more efficient. We are recommending moving the threshold for prevailing wage for new construction from $400,000 to $1 million, and for renovations for $100,000 to $400,000 to allow municipalities to have predictability. The one thing we hear from municipalities day after day is, listen, we put our budget together, you guys don't ever get yours together on time, and then you change things as we go. We have to set our budget, and then we rely on you to keep your word, and that changes regularly. So our goal is to allow municipalities to have that predictability in doing their budgets, and this goes a long way in regard to that. We'd like to conduct an in-depth review of each state appropriation to reduce duplication and find efficiencies. An example of that is anybody who has read the state budget. You'll find 10 different line items that all have the same definition, but all have a different name. Those need to be consolidated and find efficiencies for that. And legislatively create an efficiency planning committee. Put a working group together of the stakeholders to find additional opportunities for nonprofits to take over services that they do more efficiently and they do more effectively. We have talked about before, and we'll talk about now, closing the Connecticut Juvenile Training School in favor of utilizing those community programs. From the court services to nonprofit groups to advocacy groups to the state's attorney's office to the public defender's office, everyone from top to bottom will tell you that typically kids come out of the juvenile training school at best in the same position they went in, not in a better position. We can separate people based on the violations they committed to get in there and decide where they would best be suited to do what they are there to do, to reform them, to allow them to live an effective and productive life. We'd like to enact Bill 188 from the last legislative session, which implemented a long-term plan to provide efficiencies once again to services to individuals with intellectual disabilities and designate the Investment Advisory Council instead of the retirement committees that now do it, to establish the assumed rate of return for pensions. What that will do is take some of the politics out of the process and give the job to people who actually know the numbers, not people who have other interests.
So labor initiatives, we talked time and time again about the fact that there was a promise made 2012-13 budget that we would achieve $250 million of shared sacrifices, and we've talked about that, and you guys have written about that. You'll be happy to know that today we're not going to be looking at that number. That is not part of the conversation for today because we want to move forward. We're not going to look back and say, hey, this was promised, never happened, let's just move forward. So that's what we're going to do. What we're saying is an example, if you look at Tier 2 and Tier 2A for hazardous employees, they pay exactly 4% and 5% respectively towards the retirement system. But Tier 2 employees pay nothing, and Tier 2A non-hazardous employees for both only pay about 2%. In New England, it's 7% average. We're saying, listen, so Tier 2 and Tier A should pay about 4%. At least pay something and take the 2% and go up a little bit. Those are the savings that would be achieved, $74 million. The next is a list of things that we talked about, and in our PowerPoint they're giving you, it lists them in more detail. We're not going to go through them all other than very quickly. Cap a cost of living adjustments for future retirees, not current. Cap it at 3%. Calculate the final average of salary, not based upon overtime and vacation pay. When people accumulate their vacation pay and they get a check, it's added to their salary. Well, you got a check. Why are we adding it to the salary? Doesn't make sense to us. There's part-time, temporary, and seasonal workers that we put on our retirement system. There's this FICA alternative retirement program, which is like a contribution program. Many businesses use it. We're saying let's turn those people over that. There's a savings achieved there. Suspend longevity payments in 2016 if we could, but 17 in particular is what we're looking at. We're going to look at the defined benefit contribution / defined benefit plan, and I should say defined contribution plan versus defined benefit plan. Rhode Island did it. This gets really tricky. There's a lot of law that has to be looked up in this area because Connecticut is very, very, very unique. Also, we're trying to get some figures from the HRO. It's going to take some time, and there's a cost associated with that. We think we need to increase state employee health care premiums from 10% to 15%. We need to increase the state employee dental, same amount. And it's not going to really hurt anybody substantially if our copays go from $5 to 20 to 35 to 10 to 30 to 40. That's not a major thing. And we're not talking about copays for chronic diseases or diabetes or if you're taking cholesterol. We're not talking about things like that. And when we have increases in salary, we should do it on COLAs, not on merit or annual. Just to give you an idea of what that means relative to a Tier 2, if we had the money paid, that's $2.47 a day. And that's for the pension plan. And for the health, it's $5.19 for an average of $7.66. The reason why I tell you that is I think if you were to go out in the street and say to somebody in the private sector, for $7.66, you're going to get a health plan that arguably is the best in the country, which is our plan. And you're going to get a defined benefit contribution. That is, your retirement is going to be fixed no matter what the market does for the rest of your life. Are you willing to pay $7.66 a day? I doubt that you'll find many people in that sector would say, no, I'm not willing to pay that money. I run a couple companies. I believe they would be willing to pay that money. Next slide. If we were very aggressive with the changes we talked about, it's $16.5 million in 2016. Look, it's not going to happen in 2016 realistically. I think it's very tough to do this in 2016. It is not factored into our 372. I want to be clear. This is outside our 372. However, I would suggest that it might be achievable for 2017, which is $80 million, which means we have to go to work, and we have to go to work quickly, but I think it's definitely achievable. Next slide.
Another problem that we've seen for many years is the state's ability to manage its employees. Our hands are tied in many situations, so we would like to open that up and allow the state to be able to manage in a fiscally prudent way. We're proposing to remove 20 restrictive provisions, and for an example, we talk about proposing that a 4-hour overtime stipulation be lowered to 2 hours when you have to go in and say take the place of somebody else or work overtime. Whether you work a half an hour or 4 hours, you get 4 hours of overtime. We are suggesting that go down to 2 hours for reasons that we've talked about through this proposal and throughout the years past. Ability to manage and have predictability as to where our budget goes. These changes will help to, in a large measure, control costs without hurting state employees. None of these changes, once again, result in layoffs. None of them result at this point in a hard hiring freeze, and none of them result in salary reductions. It will give us the tools to help manage our very large budget. We're also proposing, which in our opinion is probably one of the most significant parts of these proposals, to institute a mandatory approval of labor contracts by the General Assembly. As you know, that does not occur now, and we believe that our need to approve that does several things. First of all, we don't believe that should be a decision just made by one entity. Secondly, it allows the governor leverage in negotiating. So we would argue that it gives the governor's office more ability to negotiate a reasonable and fiscally prudent contract between the state and the unions.
A simple majority in both chambers. Is that right?
Yes. Once again, items not included in this proposal would be not eliminating COLAs for retirees, because we believe that if you have relied on the numbers we have given you and the promises we have given you for your retirement, we would not want to throw a monkey wrench into that at the last minute. No hard wage freeze, again, not eliminating premiums given by the state to help people with their Medicare Plan B, no state employee furloughs, being blocked again. No removing meal allowances from union contracts. The issue of President's Day versus Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday off. Not eliminating ECS earmarks, which would have saved the state close to $3 million, and not immediately eliminating certain earmarks that we have talked about before. Just a note that our deficit mitigation proposal purposefully did not include many of these because they were not items that we believe we could reach consensus on at this point. There are things we still believe should be talked about in the future, but our goal now is to try and come to a consensus with our Democrat colleagues and with the governor's office to see what we can do to move the state forward now and to make structural changes down the road. Thank you. If you have any questions.